Welcome everyone to the third in the series of Croud Academy Live. As you know, today we'll be talking about podcasts and in particular kind of an introduction to podcast advertising specifically. In terms of the agenda today, so we'll start off with a brief history of podcasts, then we'll move on to what podcast advertising is specifically. We'll then run over the kind of key considerations when it comes to planning and launching podcasts. We'll also touch on Spotify's recent announcement before looking at where next when it comes to turning that planning into activation. So an introduction to us. My name's Omri. I'm a senior programmatic manager here at Croud. I'm based in the London office, and I've got with me Duncan today.
Hi, I'm Duncan. I work in our strategy and planning team, and I've been working with Omri really to just sort of set the scene on the background to podcasting, growth over the last few years, and what we think some of the important considerations are going to be for any advertisers looking to plan campaigns. So I'll kick off with really a brief history of podcasts, and I won't dwell on this too long because I'm sure everybody knows what podcasts are and how they're used. They really started in 2004 and were created by a guy called Adam Curry who had a show called The Daily Source Code. And it really began as a means of translating an internet radio show into a downloadable program that could be saved on a device like an iPod. And since then, we've really seen significant growth. It was kickstarted in 2005 when Apple introduced support for podcasts in iTunes 4.9. Since then, growth has really risen quickly, with about 197 million Americans now familiar with podcasting, and this is based on data from Edison Research. And outside of the US, popularity has been growing globally. So you can see in countries like Australia, Sweden, Spain, and South Korea, even more respondents to this survey who responded to say that they'd listened to a podcast in the past month. So penetration of podcasts we can see is growing, not just within markets like the US and the UK, but outside of that too. So across Europe, into Australia and into Asia as well. 2019 was a key year for that growth. So this data is looking at index search trends for the term podcast since 2004, and you can see where that interest really starts to kick off when Adam Curry and the Daily Source Code coined the term. Actually, growth was a little sluggish in interest in the interim, so sort of between 2010 and 2015 remained fairly flat, and it's in the last few years that we've started to see that pick up. That's due to a few developments. Key among those, I think, is native support on iOS and Android in Apple and Google's podcasting apps, which obviously come pre-installed with phones and have helped to embed podcasting in culture and in smartphone usage as well. We've also seen the development of Spotify's offering in this space, which has been particularly big in Europe. We'll go into a bit more detail on what that looks like and also what that means for advertisers. You can get a sense from this data as well of how growth in interest in podcasting is starting to differ between markets too. So quite a pronounced rise really since 2015 in Australia here in particular. In the UK, it's interesting to look at who's driving this growth, so where it's really coming from. In demographic terms, we can see that a lot of growth in recent years has come from younger users, and that really speaks to the kind of content that's now being produced, and I think the accessibility of podcasting too. So I mentioned before the availability of native apps for podcasting for iOS and Android, and I think that's a key reason why younger people have started to get more and more engaged with the medium. And also podcast hosting now is a lot easier. It's a lot more accessible, and people are able to sort of kickstart and launch their own podcast quite easily. That being said, we also see quite significant reach still concentrated in older segments. So weekly podcast reach in the UK, about 38% of that is still falling within the 35 to 54-year-old demographic. So although recent growth seems to be coming from younger age groups, there's still quite a large part of the audience that is a little bit older than that. Podcasting heritage obviously is in audio. I mentioned that It really started as a means of being able to download and save internet radio. And this is a bit of a snapshot of UK Apple Podcast rankings from the last week. But actually what we're starting to see is that a lot of discovery now is coming through social video. So more than half of podcast discovery, based on Edison researchers' work, is coming through social video. So that means discovering and learning about podcasts through platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. But it's also really, I think, important that a lot of podcast consumption now happens through video as well. So it isn't just that people are finding out about the podcast, these platforms are also starting to consume them there as well. I mentioned before that key drivers of growth have been Apple and Google's involvement in the market. They still have dominant market share, so about 21% of the market each for Google's offering and Apple Podcasts. And this is actually data from the US, and you can see quite a large long tail of services that people use to access podcasts. But also, I think what's interesting here is the role of Spotify. So Spotify's share of the market has increased quite significantly in the last few years. And that's due to a real strategic change in direction that they've taken in order to, over time, move 20% of their content to be non-music based. And that's across paid and free subscriptions. And that penetration is really starting to make a difference, particularly in Europe, where Spotify has a larger market share than, for example, Apple Music. So Spotify is starting to disrupt this landscape a little bit. In the last quarter, so Q4 2019 compared to Q3 2019, an additional 2 percentage points of their audience began to use the platform to listen to podcasts. But that was really coupled with a really substantial growth in monthly active users across the platform in general. So 31% rise in MAUs for Spotify overall. So actually, although that increase in podcast listeners was quite slight, when you pair that with a really significant growth in their user base, you can start to see how they might be cutting into the dominant share owned by Apple and Google. And there's that figure about their target for non-music content on the platform. That's something that they've been working towards for a few years, and I think we'll only see that grow over time as people start to really focus centering their audio content, their audio subscriptions on one platform. And the subscription nature of podcasting as well, whether free or paid, is a powerful way to get somebody locked into a platform like Spotify. Shifts in platform usage have also impacted how podcasts are consumed. So in the early days, it tended to be through a laptop or desktop. Obviously, the rise of Apple Podcasts and Google's offering has started to shift that more and more on smartphones. And now, obviously, smartphone usage in consuming podcasts is dominant. And actually, what's interesting as well, despite the fact that a lot of that consumption comes via smartphones, is that we see a lot of podcast listening happening at home and often happening in the background to another activity. So you'll see that the highest percentage on this chart is actually people listening to podcasts while they're driving or they're traveling. But in reality, a lot of the lines beneath that are really focused on either home time or when people are active and doing other things. So when they're relaxing, when they're working or studying, when they're doing household chores. And so what's interesting is people are using their smartphones to listen to podcasts, but that really they're doing it in a reasonably passive sense, often while they're at home. Thinking a little bit about the current situation we all find ourselves in regarding the coronavirus, it's interesting to think about what that means for people's usage of podcasts and how they tend to listen to them. Although the percentage of people that have declared that they will continue listening to podcasts to a higher degree after the coronavirus outbreak is over, at just about 3.9% in the UK, people are saying that they're going to do more and more of the things that podcasting tends to sit in the background of. So going back to what we spoke about before about some of that passive listening, people are declaring, and this is based on a survey that Global Web Index conducted recently, that they're much more likely to continue exercising to a high level after the outbreak. They're much more likely to invest time in more hobbies and pastimes, including cooking. And that's the kind of space where we're starting to see podcasting cut into. So I think while it's interesting that fewer people are declaring that they're going to listen to more podcasts after the outbreak than we might expect, many more people are saying that they're going to do those activities where they tend to listen to podcasts in the background. So it might be that we see a slightly bigger increase than expected off the back of that. So I've included a few statistics here which I thought might be of interest. 51% is the percentage of the US population that has listened to a podcast at some point in the past, and based on current penetration, we'd expect to see that increase over time. 7.1 million is the number of people in the UK that listen to a podcast at least once a week. So again, moving just from that sort of basic level of penetration of the population through to frequency of listening. In the UK, that's over 7 million people a week now who listen weekly. And in Australia, 19% of people who regularly listen to podcasts listen to 6+ a week. So that's a really highly engaged audience. That's 20% of people who declare that they regularly listen to podcasts, listen to many podcasts, so they listen to more than 6 a week. I think that's quite significant for when we come to think about campaign planning. So I think some of the main interests, some of the main insights that we can take away here, podcast interest is intensifying. So particularly over the last year, growth was very strong, especially in the UK and Australia, but also in the US. And I think if we extended some of that analysis out to Europe as well, we'd see fairly similar trends. I think that's really being propelled by some of those new market entrants, particularly Spotify, and that strategic push on their part to diversify away from music is going to have a big impact, I think. And they are always making drives to try and capture as many new content creators as possible and get them onto the platform. Some of those demographic signals that we saw can be a little misleading. So although a lot of growth is coming from younger segments, it's fair to say that we shouldn't neglect targeting older segments as well. And a lot of this really comes down to contextual signals that we can start to see in ad inventory, which Omri will go on to talk about in a bit more detail. And finally, just sort of speaking to the current situation, although the impact of the coronavirus outbreak on podcast usage is a little unclear, I think it's fair to say that we'd expect to see an increase off the back of it. More people are listening to podcasts, but really importantly, more people are doing the activities where they might be listening to podcasts in the background. So I'll hand over to Omri now, who can take you through a bit more detail about how we can start to capitalise on that growing interest in podcasting for advertisers.
Cool, thank you, Duncan. So yeah, as Duncan mentioned, that's kind of an overview of what podcasts are and the kind of growth and the trends towards listening to podcasts. But what does podcast advertising specifically look like? So as Duncan mentioned, 7.1 million people in the UK tune into a podcast every single week. And as we all know, where there is that audience, there is, as a result, there's going to be advertising. It's no secret that podcasts are becoming a more and more popular means of channel for people to go and attain new information. And this is being reflected in the fact that businesses are planning on spending $500 million or 390 million pounds on podcast advertising by the end of 2020. So advertisers are always looking for these kind of new ways to diversify their media mix, to diversify their brand awareness strategies. And in a time when this is becoming increasingly difficult, it seems like podcast advertising might be that new kind of channel for advertisers to test. So what are the two key kind of formats that we're going to discuss today? So there's sponsorship ads and there's dynamic insertion ads. So firstly, sponsorship ads are created by the host of the podcast. So from an advertiser perspective, you'll create a kind of generic script. You'll then pass this over directly to one particular podcast. That host will then take that script and they'll personalize it to kind of their personality and also to make it fit within the flow of the podcast. So just to kind of give you an example, my favorite podcast is Freakonomics Radio, and that's presented by Stephen Dubner. So he's an economist, an author, and a journalist. So you'll give him a kind of generic script. He'll then personalize it, and it'll really kind of reflect his personality. On the other end, there is dynamic insertion ads. So this is when you create one generic ad, you then insert this dynamically into either the pre, the mid, or the post roll of podcasts. So an example of this, if you had maybe a B2B finance client, you'd create that one generic ad. You'd then dynamically insert it across a whitelist of different titles, such as maybe The Economist, the Financial Times, or another kind of relevant title. As you can see from the graphic on the screen, we can see that sponsorship ads investment in sponsorship ads do currently outweigh that's being invested in dynamic insertion ads. But this is based on a study by the IAB in 2018. And since then, we are seeing these values begin to converge. And many specialists believe that dynamic insertion ads will in fact outweigh investment in sponsorship ads moving forward. So what does the landscape look like? It's a pretty simple landscape. On the left-hand side, we have the content creators, so the likes of Joe Rogan and Dave Ramsey. And on the other side, you've got podcatchers. So we've already kind of touched on these, but Spotify, Apple Music, Google Play Store, and Stitcher. But how do we go about connecting these two? So enter ad networks, examples such as Acast, DAX by Global, and Audio Boom. And they play kind of two key roles. So the first thing is the delivery of the advertisements in matching up the content creators and the podcatchers. And secondly, they also act as a monetization platform. So any money that's generated within the podcatchers can then be passed back to the content creators. And what are the two different buying types? So there's direct and there's programmatic. Starting with kind of programmatic, and just quickly to give the listeners a definition in case anyone's kind of not familiar with programmatic. So programmatic is basically the automated and real-time auction-based buying model that currently underpins much of digital media buying. And in terms of how this relates to podcasts, so we'll see that programmatic buys are often the preferred way of buying dynamically inserted ads. This is due to the real-time nature, the dynamism, and also the flexibility. On the other hand, the direct buys, pretty self-explanatory, but when you have to manually set up these deals between the content creators or the ad networks and the advertiser, and these of course, are often related to sponsorship ads because these have to be bespoke to one particular campaign. So what are the kind of key considerations when it comes to exploring the potential of introducing podcast advertising into your media mix? As a performance agency, we have very kind of strict elements that we look at when we're kind of introducing new activity or new strategies into our media planning. So all activity must be audience-led. So what this means is just basically underpinned by a strategic audience demographic and audience targeting. Secondly, everything has to be measurable, trackable, and attributable. And then lastly, accountable. So all performance has to be possible to take all performance and pin it back to that initial investment. So what does this look like for podcasts currently compared to kind of the modern day digital marketing space? So targeting when it comes to podcasts is currently only contextual. So this will be, as we mentioned earlier, if you have a kind of B2B audience, picking a contextual set of titles that kind of match that audience. Secondly, all audience targeting is just model demographic targeting based on the demographic profiling of this specific set of podcasts. As with regular kind of other media channels, there's no capability to third-party audience data, and there's no first-party integration. So obviously first-party data is an advertiser's most valuable data. That includes kind of their CRM lists, audience lists, and cookie-based data on their site. There's currently no integration to leverage this across podcast buying. Secondly, measurability. Podcasts are measurable, but this measurability is very limited. The kind of most common metrics are impression and reach data. Two kind of reasons for the limitations are due to two key blockers. So firstly, the downloadable nature of podcasts. So 77% of podcasts are downloaded, but that are streamed, but that leaves 23% which are downloaded. And obviously, once those podcasts are downloaded on the podcatchers, they're not passing any listening data back to either the ad networks or to the other platforms. Secondly, a key blocker is the data sharing restrictions. So there's that breakdown again between the podcatchers and the ad networks in terms of reporting. So just to kind of highlight this, Apple Podcasts, who account for 60% of podcast usage, don't pass any listening or streaming data back to the ad networks, kind of in line with the Safari browser focus on privacy. So as a performance agency, we still want to tap into kind of conversion metrics. So the two key conversion metrics to consider are vanity URLs and promo codes. And we look at ways of kind of seeing an uplift in these once the podcast activity is launched. Finally, accountability, as you mentioned, simply describes the ability to tie performance back to the media spend. As measurement is limited, naturally we see that accountability is limited. It also makes it difficult to compare the performance of podcasts to other channels due to a lack of kind of consistent metrics across the multiple different channels. So what does this breakdown look like? So starting from the content creators to the podcatchers, this is where we see the issue of the monetization platform. The fact that the content creators don't receive that kind of, they don't have that monetization platform in place to receive the credit for that exchange in content. Then moving from podcatchers to ad servers, this is where we see the first breakdown of data sharing, with obviously specific podcasts like Apple in particular not passing listening data back to ad servers. Between ad servers and buying platforms, we see a breakdown in real-time accountability, no access to that real-time accountable data. And then between buying platforms and content creators, again, there's a kind of backlog of that data sharing breakdown. But what does this look like in terms of next steps? What we're working towards, and this is basically integrating all those platforms and bringing all of those platforms together. Pass on, thanks. So the consolidation of activity within a programmatic demand-side platform such as Google's Display and Video 360 or the Trade Desk provide better insights to measurement, including advanced capabilities whereby you can match device IDs back to certain podcasts that are streamed across certain platforms. So in this setup, the podcatcher notifies the ad server once an ad has been played, and this information is passed back in the bid request. This is kind of the ideal situation, but based on the same IAB study that was undertaken in 2018, this then only accounted for under 5% of all of digital podcast buyers. We are seeing this kind of increase day on day, but there's still kind of a big gap in terms of reporting. On the right-hand side, in addition to this, is the launch of Spotify's Ad Studio. This looks to be kind of the future of measurability and consolidated podcast buying. So we'll have a look at that in a little bit more detail now. So Spotify's recent announcement, just kind of drawing it back what's currently available to Spotify, very kind of similar to the industry as a whole in terms of impression and reach figures being the primary source of measurement and the primary and performance metrics. However, if we go on to the next slide, we can see that Spotify have now launched streaming ad insertion by Spotify Ad Studio. This is something that's currently only launched as a beta in the US, and only one advertiser have currently jumped aboard this beta, and that was in the form of Puma. But we're expecting a rollout for a beta testing in the UK in Q3 2020. So Croud are kind of now looking for different opportunities for their advertisers to jump on board this beta. To give you an overview of kind of what we can expect, Alex Lung, who is a senior product marketing manager at Spotify, defined Spotify Ad Studio as rewriting the playbook for podcast advertising, introducing data-driven marketing tools that aim to turn podcast advertising into an advanced performance marketing channel. And these are kind of lots of keywords that, as a performance agency, will get us pretty excited. So, how are Spotify able to roll out this product? And it's primarily due to their unique position in the market. So with their own content, their loyal logged in user base, of which 124 million people have globally subscribed to Spotify. And they also have this robust monetization framework, obviously that's currently used for their music streaming service. It means that they're uniquely positioned to make podcasts addressable for digital marketers. So firstly, it means that they can reach the audience they want to reach due to their vast and loyal logged in user base. The capabilities for real-time measurement. So they're planning on introducing real-time impression data, but also in particular real-time listening data. So this will all be passed back for podcasts that are owned and operated on the Spotify platform, and buying that's done within the Spotify Ad Studio. Also, they'll be able to report back on demographic insights, so the demographics of your audience in real time, which will enable kind of optimizations towards particular podcast titles while the campaign is still live. And then lastly, from a kind of reporting perspective and an insights perspective is the understanding of the impact. So they will have a new measurement suite, which will include brand uplift studies, which are going to be based on, which we think are going to be based on surveys of listeners to your particular ad on the podcast. So from here, that's kind of podcast advertising. But how do we go about planning an approach to launching podcasts?
Yeah, so with all of that in mind, I think there are a few key areas that advertisers should be looking at if they want to consider podcasts as part of their media mix. The first one is audience. Omri touched on some of the difficulties in place at the moment for targeting particular audiences on podcasts. And I think it's worth remembering that this is a pretty nascent channel. It's difficult to find the level of maturity in targeting that we might be used to elsewhere, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's inaccessible. I think the important thing here is to understand at the beginning the audience that you're looking to target and how that translates into the targeting options that are available on certain platforms. So that might be deterministic targeting on Spotify based on user demographics. If you can't use that, then what proxies are available that you're comfortable with? What are some of the contextual targeting options that you might be able to deploy instead? And are you happy with them? You know, does that, in your mind, get you close to that target audience that you need to reach? The second point is inventory. So are you buying direct or programmatically? So it really, with this approach, it's best to consider what best serves your audience. So to the first point, how can you reach them and how can you land your message most effectively? You know, if you're using contextually relevant targeting, you know, does this get you closer to that target audience than other types? In terms of creative, if you're not already using audio creative, think about how you can use the format to best engage your audience and drive action. A lot of us will be used to using very visual assets and used to a really fundamentally different kind of user engagement. So avoid using the same kind of language that you would naturally put into banner advertising or social, and instead think about it in terms of how somebody might hear the message that you're putting across in audio. It's a basic point, but I think the fundamental here is we're approaching the channel from the ground up. You know, how can you best use audio if you haven't already done so before? And then finally, measurement. Establish what you want the campaign to achieve. Avoid setting vanity KPIs because it's difficult to set more tangible ones. I think there's a real risk that advertisers go into this working off the basis of site visits or just reach even. I think we can do a little bit better than that, and that's something that we can help with if you have questions about it. And then also just consider how your choice of measurement affects attribution where it's possible, and also the customer journey. So if you're using a custom URL, think about how that might fit into the user journeys that you've planned in your other channels. If you're using a promo code, try and only do so where you're really looking to get a direct response from the advert. It's no good using a promo code for a campaign where you're looking to build awareness just because you can't think of another form of measurement. So I think be really careful about how you use the forms of measurement open to you, and think about how they might impact a consumer's journey and interaction with your brand. But more fundamentally, think about the opportunity. So starting from the beginning, do podcasts really offer the incremental reach that you can't get from existing, more easily attributable channels? So you can really start to get to a view of this by analysing your existing segmentation, thinking about who it is you're reaching, who's visiting your website through direct or organic channels, and where you might be missing out on certain segments. And then have a look at podcasting as an option for where you think you can reach those segments more cost effectively than in other environments. It's no good just thinking about the channel as a nice to have or a good testing option on a plan. Really think about where it can offer that incremental benefit. And then finally, post-campaign, really focus on the true impact. So beyond just short-term measurement, what is it that the campaign is delivering? And there are a few options here to try and get to some of that incremental reach that the channel can offer. It might be geographic split testing where that's possible. It might be on-off phasing over certain months for media buys to understand incrementality. And post-campaign, you can start to assess the cost of that reach in order to understand what the true benefit has been. By all means, keep a close eye on the CPA, but also if you're using a custom URL, think about building segments of those site visitors in Google Analytics, for example, to better understand the traffic quality that you're getting as a result of that podcast advertising, and also the role of those people in the conversion journey. So it might be that you start to see that segment taking a bit longer to convert or to perform the action that you want them to on site than you'd originally planned for. That's great insight that you can then pass back into the planning process for future campaigns. So thanks. That's our introduction to podcast advertising. A bit of the background, the size of the market and the opportunity, how you can go about starting to use various platforms and techniques to reach your target audience, and then how you might want to go about planning your campaigns going forward. So we can open up the floor to questions if anybody has any.
Cool. So we've got 4 questions that have come through the Q&A. So the first one is, will these slides be made available after the webinar? So yes, they will. We'll make sure we send them around to anyone that signed up via the online portal. The second question is about the figure of £390 million or $500 million of spend on podcasts in 2020. Just to confirm, that stat was a US stat, so it's the predicted spend on podcasts in the US by the end of this year.
I think it's worth just jumping in there. It's worth saying that data about the podcast market is quite difficult to come by, and I think that's because it's quite a fragmented ecosystem. You've got quite a lot of podcasts, as Omri said, being downloaded and listened to at different points. You've got different providers that don't tend to speak to each other, i.e. Apple and Google. So it's quite difficult to collate information on the market. So in some cases we've used UK data here. US data is a bit of a proxy or a steer as for what might be coming. So if there are any clarification questions on the data sources that we've used, then just fire away.
Cool. Yeah. The next question is around frequency capping and the capabilities for podcast advertising, such as via Spotify, and any thoughts on kind of optimal frequency. So the question of frequency capping kind of comes back to that lack of listening data that's passed back to the ad networks. This is obviously a restriction when it comes to frequency capping. as a kind of aspiration point, or a place where podcasts kind of want to reach, a good way to look at it is audio ads. So audio ads in general. Currently, there in a lot of cases there are frequency capping capabilities, and these frequency capping capabilities are enabled when you can tie a device ID back to the insertion of an ad into a podcast. So it's something that's also going to be available in the Spotify Ad Studio, which is kind of important to mention. And it's something that, we kind of see as a bit of a limitation when it comes to planning and measuring the performance of podcast advertising, as obviously frequency capping is something that is very important across all of our standard digital buys. In terms of an optimal frequency for ads, this should probably be answered on kind of a campaign by campaign basis. But it's obviously a really engaging format. You're reaching people when they're really engaged in a medium and a piece of content that they're really interested in. So we kind of look at initially trying to keep frequencies at a kind of low level and working from there. Do you have anything to add to that, Duncan, or do you think that covers it?
No, I think just on the frequency capping point, there are some D2C brands in particular that have become a bit of a byword for podcast advertising, partly because they've sort of historically operated at like very high frequencies across a number of different podcasts. Squarespace is one that springs to mind. I think studies on effectiveness are probably going to come in time. I don't think we're sort of at that point yet, where we can be confident about the frequency level that is most effective within podcasts. But it might be something, if you're concerned about it, that you can start to manage through the choice of inventory you run as well, and trying to select maybe perhaps a broader range that users might, so you might not be hitting the same people on multiple occasions.
Cool. So the next question is, can you explain more about what you mean by vanity URLs and promo codes? So the way that these are used in podcast advertising, these should be mentioned in the advertisement. So it would say / during the ad, in terms of vanity URL, visit the advertiser's domain / maybe podcast 30. And if you visit that particular URL, that's when you'll kind of measure the uplift on that specific URL. In terms of promo codes, so again, this would be mentioned within the podcast, and it might be something like enter code podcast 30 at checkout, and you'll receive 30% discount on your purchase. And obviously, from a measurement perspective, we'll look at the number of people that have used that promo code during the activity being live.
There are some brands will also use post-purchase surveys on, how did you hear about us, and collate responses of people that said it was via a particular podcast in order to get to that answer about driving awareness.
Cool. Next question: how do dynamic insertion ads work on Spotify if you're a premium member? So there are no ads for premium members. For audio specific ads, one of the benefits of signing up to be a premium Spotify member is that you're not hit with any ads at all.
It's worth adding to that as well. I mean, we spoke about Spotify's growth in monthly active users from Q3 last year into Q4. It's worth saying that that's fairly even across paid and free. So the acquisition that they're driving is not simply converting free members into paid. They're also starting to acquire quite a significant number of new free subscribers. So that base of people to advertise to is also growing.
Cool. The next question: do you think podcast advertising can effectively drive sales directly given the attribution / measurement issues, or should it be viewed as a brand awareness channel? I'm happy to kind of kick this one off. So I think it kind of depends on the format, firstly. So initially, sponsorship ads were kind of the original format for podcasts, and including things such as the vanity URLs or the promo codes do allow the driving of acquisition metrics and the measurement of acquisition metrics. But I think due to kind of all the things we've discussed in terms of the lack of kind of impression level data and the lack of listening figures at the moment, podcast currently sits probably as more of a brand awareness channel and a way of kind of diversifying current brand awareness activity that advertisers are running.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the forms of measurement that are available are really designed to try and measure that impact of brand awareness. So, trying to understand the number of people that might have been through to the website after listening to a podcast. It isn't necessarily just about starting to work back to a CPA. I think it's also sort of worth thinking about podcasting in the context of other channels that have applied a direct response lens to what's mainly brand awareness activity, like a DRTV or a DR print ad. I think most advertisers that have used those formats would still be KPIing that media and thinking of that media as awareness driving, but with the added benefit of being able to start to tie it back to an impact on conversion and a CPA. So I think it's, as Omri said, really focused on brand awareness and probably most effective there at the moment, but starting to move towards a more attributable model, and there are techniques you can put in place to get a kind of hybrid.
Cool. So the next question: can you get data regarding placement performance, i.e. for specific podcasts, and then tie this back to time of day and day of week? So this depends on what performance metrics you're looking for. And what platforms you use. So largely impression data and delivery data can be pulled at a placement level, and you can pull back time of day and day of week by placement. However, if you're looking at kind of listening data, again, we kind of fall into those restrictions we discussed earlier, where the specific podcatchers aren't passing that data back to the ad network. And yeah, did you have anything else to add to that at all, Duncan?
No, I don't think so. I think again, it's likely to be something that is going to evolve quite significantly over time. One that we can sort of monitor closely. Yeah,
and yeah, just actually one last point. So the Spotify Ad Studio will enable placement level performance in terms of kind of day parting and the placement performance, but that will only be for podcasts that are owned and operated by Spotify and are delivered on the Spotify podcast app. Finally, I think this is the last question: what's the average cost or range of advertising for each podcast ad format? So podcasts are generally bought on a CPM basis. Naturally, kind of as you'd expect, the sponsored ads are slightly more expensive due to that kind of increased lead time and the premium nature. And depending on the podcast, you're looking at spending between kind of like £30 and £50 CPM. If you're then looking at dynamic insertion ads, these are much cheaper. Usually these kind of back out about maybe a £10 CPM across the course of a campaign. And I think that's it in terms of questions. Thank you very much, guys, for kind of tuning in. Our email addresses are on the screen now if there's kind of any kind of follow-up questions or any other inquiries, and we'll be happy to answer them. But yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, tune into the next episode.
Thanks everyone. Bye.